Hi, class. Today, I'm going to talk about zines. So we're going to talk about zines, and let me also explain it's Z-I-N-E, not Zine. It's zine like magazine. We're going to talk about zines because this is going to be one of our projects that we're going to work on in the class. In fact, it's going to be our biggest project, our final project. And what we're going to be doing throughout the class is we're going to be moving through several different exercises, building the content for this magazine that we're putting together. So for those who don't know what a zine is, then this is why I'm giving this presentation right now. So let me go ahead and do a little explanation. So I'm going to share this, share a screen with you. So give me 1 second. All right. All right. So what's a zine? We have a couple different definitions for zines. And if you read in the textbook, I have an article that I wrote about this. And essentially, a zine is really hard to define. A zine is a small independent publication, and it usually has a fairly small print run. It's often put together by one person, maybe two people, and few people ever make any money off these things. That's not always the rule, but that's basically what they are. And I can show you a couple examples of some, but let me give you some of the history of it first. So some of the history of the zine, well, this is I'll just read this presentation right, or this slide right here. This is from a store over in Chicago called Quimby's Queer Store, and it was a store where it just solely sells zines, and that's the only thing. To my knowledge, that's the only store in the country, maybe even the world, that only sells zines. So it's a bookstore that just sells zines or zine-related books. But from their definition, zines, producing, are self-published books and magazines. Zines are made by artists, writers, makers, readers, zookeepers, bankers, teachers, farmers, hoarders, thinkers, eaters, wishers, lovers, people who do or do not wear plaid, musicians, astronauts, fans of stuff, mechanical engineers, sports enthusiasts, foodies, punks, programmers, cat owners, Martians, and everybody else. So as you can gather from this, a zine can be about anything. In fact, if you don't see a zine that meets your requirements of what you like to read, then the challenge is yours. To go ahead and create these. The only thing that would stop you from creating a zine would be your own desire not to do it. So, but for this class, of course, that won't be an option. You'll have to do that. But this is how broad the spectrum is. So people will think of zines as being all about punk, and it's definitely not the case at all, especially these days. Some people will think that zines have certain leanings or certain subject matter, and it's just not the case. Zines can cover anything that they want, anything that the writer wants to cover. And as long as the writing is good, then people will read it, and that's generally the case. So let's move through this presentation. Right, so some of the history and background of zines goes back to the science fiction category, science fiction genre. So in the early 1930s is when we started to see what we think of as modern zines. Now, some zine writers will place the history of zines going all the way back into the 16 and 1700s with the political pamphlets. Probably most famous would be Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I personally don't buy that. I feel that the political pamphlets of those periods were a bit different than what zines are, although there's a lot of similarities to it. And same thing with these science fiction magazines, science fiction products, and the first ones actually call them zines also. And why they're different is because they don't necessarily have the same content. However, it still fits within the category. And I hate to be one of those people that says that you won't know it until you see it, and that's one of the best ways to define it. But in some ways, that's the case. Just because something is photocopied, put together in a certain format and stapled, doesn't really make it a zine. A lot of pamphlets in the workplace also would meet the same specifications, but aren't a zine. So in some ways, it is really, you know, when you see it. And also when people call the work zine. So if somebody calls it a zine, then essentially that's what it is. And that's a little bit of how we're going to create our projects when we're working in the class. Some of the stuff we do might not necessarily fall into what would typically be called a zine because they're not going to be mass produced, although you can do that. Because of that, maybe ours might fall into the category of scrapbook, which if you think of this as a zine, then that still might fit into that same category. At any rate, the science fiction genre was where we started to see zines. And one of the reasons why science fiction was one of the places where they started to come out, or at least in science fiction magazines, is because the writers for a lot of these science fiction magazines were responding to other writers that were out there within the genre. Some people had written to science fiction magazines saying that the content in the magazines wasn't really all that science, didn't really have much to do with science, or there were incorrect facts within the science fiction magazines, and they're often ignored by the publishers of these magazines. So as a result, the people started to create their own. The things that allowed for this to happen were not only the desire to write, but also the creation of what's called a mimeograph machine, which is an early predecessor to the photocopy machine. So as people can start to create their own magazines, then we start to see these publications come out. So what's different than what happened with the political pamphlets of the 1600s, the technology for those had to deal with the printing press. Now, you really don't even need the printing press. All you need is one of these machines. And if you have the machines, then you can create these on your own. Or at least if you have access to the machine, you can create these on your own. This magazine right here, the small magazine, was a science fiction zine, and it was created by a few individuals, and they distributed this amongst their own circles. They put advertisements in the back of larger science fiction magazines, and they created these. And these were around for years and years. In fact, Pensacola had at least one that you can check out at the UWF archives if you want to dig into it and see what people were writing about locally. This is one of the early predecessors, and I see this as probably a closer grandparent of the zine, modern zine. So also what propelled the zine movement was a number of political factors, a number of socio-political factors. So in the 1960s, we see the rise of what's called the underground press revolution. And this took place throughout the country. 1965, there are about 5 independent newspapers, small publications, underground newspapers. And within a short period of time, 5 years, that number of 5, which were all located in major cities in the United States, New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, and a couple other spots. And from there, nearly every city in the country, major city, minor cities, medium city, small towns, started to have these small publications, small underground newspapers, including Pensacola. Pensacola had a newspaper called the Gulf Coast Fish Cheer, and it went around for about a year. And what they were doing was responding to the mainstream publications that were ignoring the movements that were taking place. Essentially, larger newspapers, larger magazines were ignoring or dismissing the countercultural movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And as a result, the publishers, or the people that became publishers, they decided to take the media into their own hands. There's a phrase from the singer for this band, the Dead Kennedys. His name is Shella Biafra, and he says, "Don't hate the media, become the media." And this is what people started to do. Instead of hating the media, although they might not have loved the media, they did decide to create their own media. So they created these newspapers. And one of the newspapers that came out of this period was a magazine called Rolling Stone. Now, a lot of these newspapers had very strong political bents. Rolling Stone made a conscious decision not to go in the political route, heavily go in the political route, and they focused more on the music. And that might have been one of the reasons why it was sustained for a little bit longer, because there were political attacks on a lot of the more political newspapers during the Vietnam War era. And Rolling Stone, for a number of reasons, was able to circumvent that. And it started to grow, and it graduated, if you want to put that in quotes, graduated into a mainstream publication. So this started in the late 1960s, and then as it started growing into the 1970s, then we started to see other publications and other movements come about. So if you think of Rolling Stone as being a reaction to the 1960s counterculture and covering the 1960s counterculture, as that group of people, the hippies and all those people, started to get older, then, as you can imagine, a younger group of people, about 10 years younger than them, came about. And this was when punk started to become a big thing. So as punk started to become a really big thing across the United States, there started to be a movement in the United States, over in England, and other countries around the world. The mainstream news publications, the mainstream music publications in particular, rarely wrote about it, or if they did, it was often in a deriding way, or people would take pictures of folks with mohawks and funny haircuts and different clothing, and would turn it into some kind of circus. And that a lot of people felt that as people were not focusing on the movement itself and the political movement itself. So they did what the science fiction folks did, and also what Rolling Stone did, and the other people of that generation, just 10 years prior, they decided to take the media into their own hands and create their own media. The biggest thing that helped them, though, to create this media was the advent of a photocopy machine. So a photocopy machine, I'm sure you've seen these before, maybe use them as well, really propelled this, because what that did more than the mimeograph machine was that it allowed for people to create this medium on their own. So whereas before you might have needed to take your underground newspaper over to a publisher, have it printed, or find somebody with a mimeograph machine and then continuously run these copies, which was a bit of manual labor that went into it. Not an easy thing to publish either. The photocopy machine let people put them through the machine, and then essentially in the 3 or 4 seconds that you could have your own magazine, all you needed was now the staples and, again, the will to do it. So I'm showing you this cover right here. This is from 1977, January 1977. We see Jeff Bridges on the cover. We see a professional publication. It had graphic designers that were behind this, and they did everything they could to make this look beautiful and like a strong publication, just like Rolling Stone is. The exact same month, this publication also came out. Now, I know the title might be a little wild for you, but this was a pretty important publication. Interestingly, if you could get your hands on one of these copies, this although it was probably given away, if maybe sold probably not much more than $1 each, is now worth thousands of dollars if you can find an original copy of this. But this newspaper, or this magazine, was called Sniffing Glue. And the people that are covered in here, if you can see that cursor on here that I'm pointing to, the bands that were covered were pretty big bands. The Sex Pistols was seen as one of the biggest bands in punk, and one of the premier early punk bands. Generation X was another really big band, one of the big bands for the late 1970s, early 1980s, and they were big enough to where the generation itself, Generation X, the generation I come from, took its name from this band. So for various reasons, but this is where Generation X, the generation, gets its name from this band featuring Billy Idol, who you might know. So we have this magazine coming out at the same time. So what makes it different than Rolling Stone is, if you look at this, we have a very professional publication. We have somebody who probably went to graphic design school who set up this design. We have a professional photographer, more than likely, brought this big movie star into this publication room. They took the pictures. Everybody sat around. Editorial boards were deciding what was going to go on this, what wasn't. And then we have this, which likely was done in a day, maybe 2 days, maybe 3 days, but probably not much more than that. And interestingly, has a lot of cultural staying power. Again, this is one of the premier zines, one of the most famous zines from this period, the 1970s. And if you look at this, as opposed to this one here, go back one more time. If you look at Rolling Stone, it would be hard for me to put this together. It would be hard for most people to put something together that looked like this. Now, you might be able to have these skills if you use a good Photoshop program, and you might be able to put something similar together. But this one right here, all you need is a Sharpie. You need a Sharpie and Sharpie, glue, and a photographer to take some pictures, and maybe just a little knowledge of how to use a copy machine, which only takes you a few minutes to do. And likely this person put this together within a really short period of time. So what you see here, as opposed to this one, this is professionalism. This is immediacy. This speaks to a movement. This speaks to something that's growing right now at this moment. Be here. You got to see this. So this is, as the New York Times uses this phrase, the first draft of history. If we think of punk rock, the beginning of this movement, as history, countercultural history, then this is history in the making. This is the rough draft of history right here. So we see a progression of the zine. So the zine started in the 1930s. I argue started in the 1930s and started with the science fiction genre, science fiction small magazines. Then we go into the 1970s, where magazines like Sniffing Glue, and there were other ones that came about in that period. We see that, and then we move into the 1990s, where it really started to grow. And it started to grow because the ubiquity of the photocopy machines became more, and then punk started to really grow in the 1990s. So as this movement, which was a writing movement, a movement of writers from the 1980s and early 1990s, started to grow and started to meet the movement of punk as it started to really blossom with bands, particularly with bands like Nirvana or with bands like Green Day, when they started to really explode in the early 1990s. Then also the culture that came along with it, which had to deal with this communication that was being done. Remember, this is pre-internet, of course. So this is how people communicated. This is how people expressed ideas. This is how people wrote stories about their lives. This is how they wrote about bands. This is how you found out about bands. This is how, if you were in a band, how you booked shows. You found out about records. You found out about all sorts of stuff, movements that were taking place through these publications. And how you found them was through other publications, similar to the 1930s, where you buy one big magazine, and in the back of the magazine it had small classified ads. You look in those small classified ads, and then you see advertisements for it, or you saw reviews for them. I'm wearing a shirt right here, and it's for this magazine called Maximum Rock and Roll. This was one of the biggest punk zines that came out in the 1980s, and was really around until just a year or so ago. In print form, it still is around as a website, but it's a little different now. But in the back of Maximum Rock and Roll, or MRR, they would have advertisements. They would do zine reviews, and then you'd look in the back of the reviews, you'd find out about other zines, and then you'd look and you'd find your people, essentially. So you'd find this through essentially an underground connection that wasn't necessarily really underground, but it was more hard to find. You can find it if you knew where to find it, but once you found it, then once you were in there, then it was hard to ignore and hard to not see anymore. And a lot of people stuck around in these movements. So some people just jumped into zines and did it for a really brief period of time. They left. Some people did it as a stepping stone to some other writing publications. Most famous person I can think of is Matt Groening from The Simpsons. He started off as a zine writer and went on and created The Simpsons. So a lot of other people did this, but besides those folks, there's a lot of people that stuck around in the genre itself. Okay, so I'm going to show you this one video right here. This is from the Jacksonville Public Library. And this has to deal with their town and their zine library at the Jacksonville Public Library. We have one here at UWF as well.
Zines are self-published magazines, pamphlets done in limited runs by people or collectives about all manner of topics. You got ones on music, politics, cartoons, cooking, science fiction, short stories, personal zines, anything.
The Jacksonville Public Library decided to include zines as a part of the collection because it's just something different. There aren't many libraries anywhere with a zine collection, and given the amount of material that's out there, it's a good idea for us to start cataloging and preserving it.
We started out with about 200 worth of donations, and since then it's grown to about 1,200. We have, about 800 more to catalog yet. We try to add about 30 into the collection a month. The collection covers everything. Unlike a lot of zine libraries in academic libraries, we circulate our items like books. They check out for 3 weeks. Patrons turn them in. You just do them like comic books with the bag and board to keep them safe.
We do house the zine collection in the popular department at the main library. However, they do circulate throughout the system. So if you check out a zine and you'd like to pick it up at another library, you can pick it up at your location.
Zines have an advantage that blogs don't, as in they're more of a deliberative medium. And it's always cooler to have a physical object in your hand. It's not just you firing off whatever thoughts and then being immediately out into the virtual space. A zine, you give it some more thought. You actually have to lay it out on a page. You have to put it together. You have to take probably a financial loss getting it out there.
Zines are important to library customers and the community in general, just because they offer up a different viewpoint. They offer an alternative point of view, a different perspective on art, literature, civics that you would never get otherwise. the library hosted a zine symposium on November 19th, and really what that was is it was a way to sort of get the community excited about our zine collection.
Kathleen Hanna was our guest speaker. She's from Kinikil, the Tigray, founder of the Riot Girl movement and artist. She came in and delivered a keynote lecture.
It not only gives people a chance to see important people or interesting people talking about things that interest them, but it gives them a chance to participate too. Our panel discussion had a participation section at the end, and the Q&A just went on and on and on because people are so interested in talking about it.
We wanted to get different perspectives of people who had sort of come to zines from different areas. Like someone like Sheldon got his start in zines, and now he's writing for places like the Folio and other magazines. Travis, he approaches it both as a zine writer and a librarian archivist, so that's a valuable perspective to have. Mark Cregan actually makes a student do zines, so I think that's pretty cool, like in this time. And Adi Roberson, she's deep in zine culture, and of course Kathleen Hanna. Duncan, he runs an independent press. He's been in a lot of hardcore bands in the 80s of some repute, so they fit together really well.
Kathleen Hanna presented sort of a keynote presentation called The Personal is Political, and really what it was is it was sort of a slideshow of her history, sort of musically and as a zine author. She showcased the zines that she started back when she was in college. She showcased the art that she made as a part of her band and as a part of her zines, and she kind of looked at where zines are going in the future. Getting Kathleen Hanna was a coup. People were really excited about that. She was excited to be here. It was really, it was an amazing day.
All right, get out of this if I can. Okay, stop this share. All right, so I wanted to show you some of this and give you a little bit of the background to the zines and the production of the zines themselves. So essentially, the main thing that you need to put together a zine is the idea and the willingness to put one of these together. For our class, for our discussion, we are going to, or for our discussion series as we're moving through the class, what we're going to do is we're going to create the content for the zine. I'm going to show you a number of zines in the class, traditional zines. I'm also going to show you a number of zines that students have created. I've brought in just a few of them. Now this one here is a nice little zine. It's kind of cool. They gave it a really interesting cover. It's kind of hard to see on here, but it's a cloth cover, but on the inside it has many stories. It's about somebody writing about their child being born, and all sorts of different stories that have to deal with pregnancy, essentially. Justifying the hospital choice, midwives, and all sorts of things. We have this one here. It's another zine, small publication. And many of these are small, some are larger. I have a couple that are back here. Which one? This one I did, this is, well, I can't see it because it's disappearing, but this one I did in 2000. This one I did in I think that issue is in 2008, 2009. I personally have been writing zines since 1995, so I've been doing this for quite some time. And my most recent one came out just a couple weeks ago, so I'm sorry, a couple months ago. So I still do them. I'm still around, even though I have other works published and I publish in various other publications. I never saw this as a stepping stone somewhere else. I see this as a very deliberate medium, as it was said in the video. And I think it's one of the best ways for us to look at zines is to think of these as a deliberate medium. And I want you to be able to see them in that capacity. And also I want you to be able to experience this as a writer, as a public writer. Because when we think of writing in the public sphere, we often think of this as something that we have to find publishers. We have to find somebody to create the thing for us, to create the place where we're going to put this, our writing. So are we going to put this in on the internet? Are we going to put this on a blog? Are we going to put this in some publication, print publication? And how does it get published in the first place? And what I like about zines is it allows you to be the person to create this. It puts all of the the production into your own hands and allows you to become the person who produces. So that's essentially the lecture I want to talk about, what I wanted to go through. In the textbook, I have a chapter where we go through this in a bit more detail. So I'd like for you to read that. And also I'd like for you to read the corresponding articles that go along with this. If you have the opportunity, on the second floor of the UWF library, we have a zine library. And if it's possible, I'm not sure if it is, but if it is possible, what I'd like to do is to be able to bring the class over there to take a look at it. But if not, then you can do this on your own individually and go take a look at some of the zines and just pick some at random and see some of the stuff that other people are writing in, and look at the medium that you're about ready to enter, because you're about ready to enter a conversation, which is what we do in rhetoric. So we look at this and we think of the audience, we think of the purpose, we think of the reason why it exists in the first place. And we're essentially creating the rhetorical triangle in many, many different ways, right? Because it certainly is a form of rhetoric and definitely is a form of public writing. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to holler at me. I'm happy to talk to you endlessly about zines. Take care.